All right, it's great to see everybody here. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Leshin. I'm the president of the Planetary Sciences section of AGU, and I'd like to welcome those of you in the room and those of you who are with us online to our special sessions honoring leaders in planetary science and hearing our exciting named lectures this year. We have a fantastic lineup for you shown here on the slide of what we're going to be doing in the next 2 hours. So it's going to be very exciting. We'll start with the Shoemaker lecture, and then after that, after we hear the Shoemaker lecture, we'll move on to the inaugural presentation of an award that was just approved this year, the Ronald Greeley Early Career Award in Planetary Science. And finally, we'll present the Whipple Award, the highest honor our section bestows, and hear a lecture from the Whipple Award winner. So I hope you're up for a great afternoon of planetary science. Let's get started with the Shoemaker lecture. This lecture honors the memory of Gene Shoemaker, shown on the left of this slide. Gene, of course, is really considered the father of astrogeology. His legacy of scientific excellence and his drive for discovery are certainly in line with AGU's core mission to promote discovery in Earth and space science for the benefit of humanity. I'm very pleased to introduce this year's Shoemaker lecturer, Maria Zuber, from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. To put it concisely, Maria is one of the most highly respected and highly accomplished scientists in our field. She serves as the E.A. Griswold Professor of Geophysics at MIT and recently completed service as head of her department there. She was, by the way, the first woman to lead a science department as MIT. Go woman. And it has just been announced that she'll be taking on her next challenge at MIT. She will become the vice president for research there in January. Yay. But of course, her accomplishments are equally impressive in the scientific arena. She is well known for using altimetry, gravity, and tectonic data to determine the structure and dynamics of the Earth and solid planets, and for her work on instruments and missions used to acquire this data, including, but not limited to, LRO, Dawn, Messenger, MRO, and others. And of course, most recently, she served as the principal investigator of NASA's Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, or Grail, mission, which we will hear about today. And they've had a great morning of sessions so far, and we're excited to hear even more. Her awards and honors are too numerous to list, but here are a few. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a past winner of the G.K. Gilbert Award from the Geological Society of America, and the AAS Planetary Society Carl Sagan Memorial Award. We are especially excited to have her here with us today because tonight she will be awarded the Harry Hess Medal of the AGU, given for outstanding achievements in research on the constitution and evolution of Earth and other planets. So tonight she'll receive the Hess Medal, which is a union-level medal, very exciting for Maria and for all of us in planetary science. She is really an inspiration, and I'm very happy to say a friend, delivering this year's Shoemaker lecture entitled Gravity, Topography, and the Early Evolution of the Moon. Please help me welcome Maria Zuber.
Okay.
It's that. Yep. Can I got it?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Laurie, for the wonderfully kind introduction. It's great to see you all here. I can't even tell you how much of an honor it is to be giving a lecture in honor of Gene Shoemaker, who was extremely influential to planetary science and really to me personally as a scientist. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And giving this lecture, it's really a celebration of not my own work. I think really the only thing that I ever really should get credit for is picking the right people to work with. In planetary science, and especially when you're involved in missions, everything is based on a team. So our engineers, our scientific colleagues, our students, all of these people really cause us all to rise up and do things that none of us can do in isolation. And to me, that's been a real motivating factor in my career. I wanted to give you a little bit of context. So I'll be talking today about the moon, and this is really a lesson in the fact that if you can make a precise measurement, that you can really translate something as simple as the distance between 2 points, determined very accurately, to unravel the evolution of the solar system. And so this is going to be some examples of how these measurements can contribute in that regard. Okay, so I want to start with talking about relative and absolute chronologies on the moon. So the moon is a very special place. It is the best preserved example of a differentiated planetary body that happens to be right next door. Okay, and so it makes it accessible, and while the moon is interesting in its own light and very worthy of study to try to understand its evolution alone, it really can tell us a great deal about how terrestrial planetary bodies evolve in general. And so actually the fact that we have missions going on now, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Grail mission, and then the Messenger mission to Mercury and other missions for Mars, Dawn, studying protoplanetary bodies, the fact that we have all this data coming in together, we can actually synergize what we're learning and learn a great deal more about all of this from studying the various components. So the thing that's special about the moon, we have a relative chronology that we can develop by counting the density of craters of different sizes on different parts of the surface, which tell us a relative age. But we also have samples that have been returned from known locations where we can go into the laboratory and use techniques in geochemical dating to give us precise ages of those locations and use that to anchor the age distribution. And so the moon is the only terrestrial planetary body besides Earth where we have this kind of chronological constraint. But of course, on Earth, we don't well preserve the earliest record. And so by going to the moon, there's really something incredible to be learned by looking at that. Okay, so the earliest evolution of the moon was battered by impacts, and of course, when we look at the surface of the moon, we see that impact record preserved. But what was going on at Earth? Well, of course, Earth used to look like that. Okay, Earth was also heavily cratered, and the difference there is that those originally heavily cratered surfaces have been lost due to subduction, erosion, the presence of the ocean's deposition, and we don't see that anymore. But the ages of when this heavy bombardment occurred happens to be the period of time when the first single-celled microbes were arising on the Earth. And so understanding the early impact history and what this can tell us about early planetary environments also has something to say, really, about the tenacity of life and how and when life emerged, and so this is another thing that studying the moon can contribute towards in the general understanding of Earth science. Okay, so this presentation I'm going to focus on observations from two different missions. And I will be starting at the surface and then going deeper, and we'll begin here with addressing what we can learn about the evolution of the moon using very high integrity, high resolution, and high accuracy topography. Okay, so this is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft, which is in orbit around the moon right now, taking data. It's an extremely successful mission. It's in its extended mission with a variety of instruments that are all providing excellent information that is of relevance to lunar evolution. I'm going to selfishly focus on our instrument here, the Lunar Orbiter Laser Altimeter. Here are some pictures of it. It's about this big for scale. It's quite a small little thing, but packs a punch. Okay, this is the first multi-beam laser altimeter. It was developed by our wonderful engineering colleagues at the Goddard Space Flight Center. 5-meter spots on the lunar surface from the original mapping orbit of 50-kilometer polar orbit. LRO is now in an elliptical orbit, so the numbers are a little bit different. But here the 5-meter spot is there in red, and green corresponds to the field of view of the instrument. And we essentially pull off, we have redundant lasers in the instrument, but we pull off one beam, send it through a diffractive optical element, and split it 5 ways. And for every laser beam shot that we send out, we get back up to 5 measurements of range to the lunar surface, which, if we correct for the position of the spacecraft with respect to the center of mass of the moon, we can convert that to a radius of the moon, which we can learn very precisely. So, so by going to a multi-beam system from the previous single profiling instruments, that provides us with the across-track context that allows us to do slopes in multiple directions. So, so one can look at many combinations of baselines to get an idea of what the lunar surface is like. You can fit a plane through groups of measurements and use the normal to that plane to determine slopes, and then if you do an RMS about that plane, that provides a roughness of the lunar surface on a 25-meter scale. There's another measurement that we can make out of the instrument that provides us with an even smaller scale measurement of roughness. We send out the beam of the laser, and it has a known width of the pulse, and that pulse is spread due to its interaction of the lunar surface within its 5-meter footprint. And by measuring the spreading of the pulse, that provides a measure of the root mean square roughness within the part of the lunar surface that was illuminated by the laser. And of course, we need to take into account and make corrections for the delays in the system, the divergences, and also subtract away large-scale slopes from that, so we get the contribution within the 5-meter surface. So the final measurement that I actually don't have a chart on is when we send the pulse out, we integrate the area under the curve of the photon count as a function of time, and that provides us with the outgoing energy. We look at what's backscattered from the lunar surface, and we take the ratio of the received to transmitted energy, and that provides us with a precise but not accurate measurement of the reflectance of the surface of the moon at the laser wavelength, which is 1064 nanometers in the near infrared. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter had a real first associated with it. It turned out that the spacecraft, it wasn't possible to track the spacecraft sufficiently well to take advantage of the precision of the altimeter, which is about 10 centimeters. Okay, so we had a spacecraft that wasn't up to the task of the instrumentation, and so thank goodness LRO had an incredibly enlightened project manager who asked us to come up with a solution for that problem, and what we decided to do was to track the spacecraft from tracking stations on Earth when it is in view of the Earth. And I can't believe they let us do this, but we cut a hole in the high-gain antenna of LRO and put a little telescope in there and pick off the signal from Earth, transmit it on a fiber optic cable into the middle detector of the LOLA instrument. And we use this to determine the position of the spacecraft in orbit around the moon from Earth. So this is the first operational laser tracking of a spacecraft around another planetary body. And thanks again to LRO for allowing this to happen, because it has contributed greatly to our ability to do orbit determination and precise positioning, which I'll talk about a little bit more just in a second here. So what do we want to do when we're at the moon? Well, we want to analyze many data sets, and we want all of these data sets to be co-registered perfectly, okay, so that if we see an interesting pixel from orbit of something that's compositionally fascinating, we want to send a lander next to go exactly there and study it. So in order to do that, you need an extremely precise geodetic grid, which you can then put all the observations that you have. And this is really hard to do, but fortunately there are members of our team who are really, really interested in doing it. So one of the things that we do is we look at, as we map the moon with lasers, we look at where we cross a particular location. And unlike Mars, where the elevation of the surface changes because it snows CO2, on the moon, elevations don't change. So if you cross an area once and you cross it again, the height of the area should be the same, okay? And so what we can do is globally minimize the residuals of places where orbit tracks cross, and that tells us that we know radial elevations on the moon to about 1.8 meters, and then a long track and a cross track at the 8 to 10 meter level. So that's one thing that we can do. Another thing that we can do then is we can go look at areas on the moon where we really know where they are, okay, quite precisely. And so these are areas where we've had retroreflectors on the moon. So for over 40 years, we've been tracking the locations of the lunar retroreflectors through the very important Lunar Laser Ranging program. And so we can do a difference of what the LOLA instrument, Lunar Orbiter Laser Altimeter, versus the Lunar Laser Ranging locations tell us. And so what you can see here in the areas of the moon that we know the best, we're at a meter or less level in terms of understanding where their elevations are with respect to the center of mass. So this one right here, where we're off, we're not off. This is 3.5 meter difference between Lunicod 1. Lunicod, for the aficionados out there, Lunicod 1 was lost, okay? LRO found it, and so we don't have a 40-year record from lunar laser ranging. So I contend that the error here is due to the Lunicod LLR here, and not LOLA. But this, this really gives a sense that we know where things are on the moon extremely precisely. Okay, so here's a map of lunar topography. This is centered on the far side, so these are the far side highlands here. the South Pole Aitken Basin, the largest known preserved impact structure on the moon. The near side is on either side, and we currently have a 5.8 billion, well, that's a couple weeks old, so it's a little higher, but billion altimeter measurements out of about 2.6 billion laser shots, and with excellent along-track resolution and across-track resolution as well. And it's not the case in the extended mission, but during the nominal mission, we used to get a Clementine a day data set measurement of lunar topography. So, so if you have this information, you can determine extremely accurate maps, and we produce shaded relief maps of the moon. And as I said earlier in my talk, one of the things you want to do is be able to count craters to get relative ages out, and scientists have done that for decades, but the results have always been challenged because of biases of doing counts at different lighting angles, which did not permit consistent crater counts. So if you have a shaded relief map of very high spatial resolution, you can illuminate it from any direction you want. In fact, every direction if you want to, and do extremely precise counts of craters, and you could produce a map like this. So thanks very much to the graduate students at Brown who counted all of these craters. This is work on the LOLA team that was led by our co-investigator, Jim Head. So we were able to count all craters greater in diameter than about 20 kilometers, and be able to refine the relative ages on the moon. And I should say the greatest crater densities that we found are here on the near side and in the upper part of the far side region right here. We're close to a state of crater saturation. What this tells us is that if there was a desire to go to the moon and sample or otherwise study the oldest preserved part of the lunar crust, we now would know where to go. And so this is work in progress and continues along. So we're going to smaller and smaller crater sizes. I also want to say is last March, right before the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, I showed this map, and I said by the next Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, we're going to resolve all these craters in gravity, and we're going to be able to do it. So, okay. All right. So, we can now look at the LOLA global data sets, and so here we have topography, slopes at 25-meter baselines, surface roughness, and the reflectance measurement that I told you about. And so it's amazing what you can learn when you bring all of these data sets together. And I'm going to do a case study of the interesting crater Shackleton, which is at the very close to the moon's south pole, to show you how we can use these data sets to tell us about lunar revolution. So here's the South Pole here, and here you can see the illumination of Shackleton over the course of a lunar day. And so Shackleton is 20 kilometers across, and you can see here that the upper part of the crater, inside of the crater wall, becomes illuminated, but the sun never shines on the lower part of the crater wall, nor on the crater floor. I should say this work here was done by my former student, Erwan Mazarico. And Shackleton has been a crater of great interest because of the fact that it is, because its position close to the South Pole, it is believed to have been a crater that could sequester water ice on its floor. And we wanted to study that because of the importance of identifying water ice and other volatiles on planets. So we first thing we wanted to know was how old Shackleton was. So there was a published age by Paul Spudis and others saying that it was about 3.5 billion years old. But here's the topography here. This is it's a remarkably well preserved crater, and we quite frankly questioned how a crater like that could be 3.5 billion years old. It was based on crater counts of the upper part of the crater rim. So again, Jim Head and his students counted these craters, and son of a gun, Paul was right, which is fantastic that he was able to do this. But we were able to take it a step farther than that, and actually show that the floor was comparably old to the rim, but that the walls of the crater were actually younger than the floor or outside the rim. And so we started to think about what this might mean. This is what the floor of the crater looks like. So this, I should say, this grid of topography was a 40 kilometer by 40 kilometer grid, topographic grid that consists of about 5.8 million measurements of elevation. What you can see on the floor here is this is, we were wondering whether this was a nascent central peak because Shackleton at 20 kilometers is right at about the simple crater, complex crater transition. This is not a central peak. It's not at the center part of the crater. We now interpret this to be ejecta fallback. Here you can also see this is the part of the floor. I'm going to show you another image here in a second, but you can see evidence for landslides coming down. Here's a little bench right here where the wall has seemingly partially collapsed. Here are slope and roughness maps. The walls of the crater come close to defining the angle of repose here. You can see that the upper part of the crater wall here has the highest roughness, and this is interesting because one of the observations that has been used to suggest that Shackleton could harbor volatiles is looking at Earth-based backscatter, enhanced backscatter from Earth-based radar, but because of the viewing geometry, you can't get into the floor of the crater. You can just see the upper walls. So it could be that volatiles can explain the radar signal, but enhanced roughness could also explain the radar signal. And we just happen to see that the upper part of the walls happen to be the roughest part of the crater here. So I also wanted to point out here, right here and right here are the two places where we saw this wall collapse, and you can see that the slopes in these areas are more benign. So we're actually seeing mass movement within craters that would either have been triggered by nearby impacts or possibly moonquakes induced by tidal stresses, perhaps. But it does, that provides an explanation for why the walls could have a younger relative age than their surroundings, because material is being transported down the walls. So the last observation here, which is pretty fascinating, this is the laser backscatter measurement of reflectance. This is very difficult data to analyze, and it was led by Greg Newman, and the same sort of analysis is what was done to discover ice and organics at the poles of Mercury that was reported on this morning at this meeting and published in Science last week. But what you can see here is, so this is a measurement of I over F, or reflectance, and the walls turn out to be brighter than the floor. And what's interesting here is that part of the areas that are the brightest, okay, happen to be areas that see the sun every month. Okay, so what this told us, so of course one reason something can be brighter than the norm is if there's ice there, but another reason that something can be brighter than the norm is just if it's less space weathered than its surroundings, and because we have evidence for downslope movement, it appears that at least some of the brightening could be due to just taking material off the walls and exposing fresher material that would be brighter. We can't rule out the fact that there is water ice at the surface. In fact, we think that there probably is, but it certainly doesn't explain the whole signal. There's no reason that if it was water ice that the water ice would prefer to be on the walls rather than on the floor. So it's pretty clear that mass movement has contributed to the albedo of the surface here. And so the last chart associated with this part of the analysis indicates that Shackleton is very, very, very unusual, even as other polar craters go. Okay, so here is a map of the 1064 nanometer reflectance for a broader region over the South Pole, and clearly there does appear to be some brightening in some of the other craters, but Shackleton is practically a beacon there. It's also interesting that some areas not associated with the inside of the craters are brighter than the norm, and I should say these areas that are bright do not correlate spatially with hydrogen enhancements that have been detected by the LEND instrument on the LRO. So it continues to be a very puzzling story, and we believe that water ice is part of the story of what's going on here, but it is not water ice in isolation. It's actually a very complicated story, but we're fortunately in a position to be able to use very quantitative measurements to be able to address this. Okay, so now we're going to move to the interior and start talking about gravity data. So we have a great topography model that we can work with, and as geophysicists, we want to study many data sets. One of which is gravity, and if we combine these two data sets, we can learn many things about the interior of the planet that will tell us about its evolution. And I should say that when you look at potential fields, you can get an infinity of structures that will be consistent with the observations. But most of them will not be consistent with reality, okay? And so it's extremely important to use as much knowledge as we can from remote sensing and geological sample analysis and bring as much data as we can from these other missions together so that we can develop models that have very good constraints. And this is really the only way that we can derive dependable models of internal structure and thermal evolution. So for those of us who study gravity, the moon has been a topic of interest since the earliest time in the Apollos, since the early spacecraft have had mascons. They were tossed around by the mass concentrations on the near side of the moon. But determining lunar gravity, despite the fact that it's the first planetary body that we've made gravity maps for, has been very difficult because you can't see the far side of the moon from Earth. And what we usually do is track a spacecraft that's in orbit and basically look at the frequency shift of the signal, use that to get velocity, and then convert that to gravity. But if we're not tracking the spacecraft on the far side, we can't make a very good measurement. So what we do is we put two spacecraft in orbit, and we let them track each other, and then we don't have those constraints. So we proposed the Grail mission with the idea that with the many lunar data sets that have been provided by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, Kaguya, Chandrayaan, Chang'e, many other observables that have been obtained by the moon, that doing very, very high resolution gravity could be really a missing piece of the puzzle in terms of developing a holistic idea of lunar evolution. So we have the two spacecraft range to each other. This frequency here, the Ka band, gives us the distance change, and the S band correlates the clocks on the two spacecraft. And then we pick off a tone from the oscillator and send that down to Earth and calibrate it with the clock on Earth so that we can do a very precise calibration. And this morning I presented, and our team presented, I should say, the results from the nominal mapping mission where the two spacecraft were between 60 and 225 kilometers apart or so in an average orbit of about 55 kilometers above the moon. So this is really just to give you a sense of how precisely we need to make these measurements. So our biggest error is solar radiation pressure, which is the pressure of solar photons on the spacecraft. And while we were on the way to the moon, we turned the two spacecraft towards each other to test the full radio ranging link. And when we did that, one of the spacecraft showed one face of the structure to the sun for the first time. And right here, this is where we turned the spacecraft right here. And right here you can see this exponential here. We're watching the spacecraft degas, so you're actually seeing gases come out of the structure of the spacecraft. And the dynamic range, this is 1.5 nanometers per second squared. Okay, so that's the level that we were able to see the degassing. And well, when this happened, I knew we would be okay in terms of being able to make the measurement, but we actually needed to make measurements this good to achieve our science objectives. So this is just showing you how good the measurements are. We saw a lot of this this morning. We take a lot of random days and just look at what the range residuals are. Here we're down at 39 nanometers per second are our residuals, and so we've managed to outperform our requirements by about a factor of 5 or so. And actually, essentially, what we did is took the Grace technology. Grace is a dual spacecraft mission that is currently mapping the Earth and succeeding very well at it, and applied that to the moon. So that's what we got out of that. Okay, so here's a geophysicists like to do things in frequency domain. So these are, this is spherical harmonic degree right here. So these are the long wavelengths of the planet. These are the short wavelengths of the planet. And this is the RMS power in the gravity field. So, so the white is the Lunar Prospector mission. The yellow is the Kaguya mission. And these lines right here are the error spectra. And wherever the error spectrum intersects the power spectrum, that defines the resolution of the field. So we got out to about degree in order 150 there, although the intersection of the power spectrum indicates that maybe those missions were good to 100. Kaguya was somewhat better and had the benefit of far side tracking. But here's the power spectrum, or the error spectrum of Grail, and these measurements here, these are really this is the wavelength range corresponding to basins on the moon. This is much shorter wavelength stuff out here, and we're 3 to over 5 orders of magnitude improved over Kaguya and Lunar Prospector. So those missions were excellent and did very well, but this just goes to show you what's possible when you do a dedicated mission. We also see that we don't intersect the power spectrum out here, so can actually do higher resolution models from our primary mission. Okay, so all of us on the team think that this is the most important result of the mission so far. This is the coherence between gravity and topography, and this is Grail, this is Kaguya, and this is Lunar Prospector right here. And so it turns out that between length scales of 17 and 68 kilometers, this is how topography correlates with gravity. They correlate at the 98.5% level. So what this tells you is that nearly only 2% or less of the gravity that we see here is due to things in the subsurface at these spatial scales. And so over here, you see we've separated out the near side and the far side. So obviously there's a lot going on here down at lower degrees and orders that's associated with the thinning of the crust under lunar basins, etc. But at small length scales, most of what we see in gravity is due to topography. And so the only way that this could be the case is if the subsurface has been significantly mixed, and in fact this is evidence that the upper crust of the moon has been significantly homogenized due to impacts. And so what does this mean spatially? And well, what it means is that the topography field looks amazingly like the gravity field. In fact, this is a topography map right here, and it looks just amazingly like the gravity map. Okay. Another thing that's worth pointing out is, all terrestrial planetary bodies were being battered like this, and should have some resemblance to the moon, and they don't appear to. So Earth is rather complicated for all the reasons that are listed right here. But Mercury should have some similarities. Mars should have some similarities, and they don't appear to. And one of the things we're grappling with on the team now is how much of this is due to real differences on these planets versus the fact that we haven't measured their gravity fields well enough to be able to figure out what's really going on in terms of their crustal structure. Okay, so I have to tell one good Gene Shoemaker story. Okay, so my first experience working with Gene was on the Clementine mission, which was a ballistic missile defense mission in the early 1990s, and Clementine orbited the moon, and then a decision needed to be made. So there was some fuel left. We made our map of the moon, and did we want to go in and do a really low altitude gravity pass over Mare Procularum, or did we want to leave lunar orbit and go rendezvous with an asteroid called Geographos? So Jean had asked me to make the presentation justifying why we wanted to do low altitude gravity and not go to the asteroid. And so he pulled me aside and he said, okay, Maria, we're going to lose. Okay, the ballistic missile defense, they want to test autonomous navigation and they want to go to this asteroid, but I want you to go into that meeting and I want tears in their eyes about the beauty of doing high resolution gravity over Mare Procularum. So I did that, and so I was telling them all the stuff that I've just been telling you, and it was going really well. And in fact, it was going so well that some of the ballistic missile defense people in the audience had a call over to the Pentagon, and these generals rushed in, out of breath, and just said, forget it, we're going to Geographos. Jean undoubtedly is smiling right now because we now have our high-resolution map over Mare Procularum and everywhere else, actually, as well. So this is just a map of the free air gravity of the Moon, showing all of the significant structure that we see. And if I can get this to go, here we subtract away the gravitational attraction of surface topography, and you can see the Mascon basins that is due to a combination of mare filling and thinning of the crust, but you don't see a great deal of short wavelength structure in the Lunar Highlands, although you do see some. Okay, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because all this was discussed in greater detail this morning, but having these data sets now and analyzing them in the context of the lunar samples, which continue to be studied scientifically, and we still are making significant discoveries from them. We've been able to make maps of the density of the lunar crust. The lunar crust is substantially less dense than previously thought because of the fracturing of the lunar crust. We see variations in density that correlate with remote sensing maps. We can also make maps of the porosity of the crust. The Moon is porous to depths of at least a few kilometers at the 12% level, which is rather high. All of this consistent with battering of the crust. The highest porosity areas are in association with impact basins. And then we can use the constraints on from the previous two studies to make a crustal thickness map, finding that the thickness of the crust is considerably less than what we found before. Actually, this is the first crustal thickness map that's actually consistent with the Apollo seismic results. And there are actually a couple of basins in order to be consistent with the MOHO suggested by the Apollo seismic results, Crisium and Moscoviense, where the crust essentially vanishes, and in fact, information, the remote sensing data from Kaguya has shown evidence for outcropping of olivine. So this is additional evidence which indicates that we've sampled mantle. So then, knowing the crustal volume, we can say things about the bulk composition. Here is the thickness of the lunar crust that we've measured it. There have been some suggestions of, does the Moon have an aluminum abundance similar to Earth or greater? We now know that it does appear to be similar to Earth, which is actually consistent with the idea of a giant impact into Earth, where the impactor and Earth have been very well mixed, as suggested in a paper in Science a couple of weeks ago by Robin Canup. So the last part of this is what you can discover from that 2% of the short wavelength gravity signal that's left. So if you look at the Bouguer gravity, actually it's a mostly long wavelength structure, but we can take derivatives of it and to enhance short wavelength structure. This is work by my former postdoc, Jeff Andrews Hanna, and we found evidence for somewhere between 20 and 40 very long density excesses that do not appear anywhere on the surface. We interpret these as lava-filled dykes that are associated with early expansion of the moon. Here's one of them right here. It has no surface expression. These range in age from pre-Nectarian to Nectarian in terms of superposition relationships, and they probably don't get closer than about 10 kilometers in the surface. We've correlated them with every data set we can think of, and they are visible only in Grail. Okay, so to try to put this together now in terms of what we can use these wonderful data sets for, we can really start to quantitatively address problems in surface evolution, improving relative age estimations, the illumination conditions, and really quantitatively studying degradation processes on planetary surfaces. We can go in and study the structure of the lunar crust, getting the thickness and the volume, and looking at the homogenization due to impact, improving constraints on bulk composition, and trying to detect very subtle subsurface structures that are telling us about the early evolution of the moon, but won't be visible at the surface because the impact record has wiped all of that information clean. And there's even more to come. Today we brought Grail down in the extended mission to an average altitude of 23 kilometers, and tomorrow we are taking the average altitude down to 11 kilometers average altitude, and we'll be doing a high-resolution map of the Oriental Basin, where we'll be orbiting at 2 kilometers or so above the basin rings. And so the fun continues, and there will be better gravity maps to combine with altimetry and other data sets. And so I think really the best is yet to come in terms of trying to understand what these data can help tell us about lunar evolution. So thank you very much. Surely there are questions. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so okay, so I'll repeat this because we're online. So tidal responses. We're actually analyzing the topography to look for the H2 tide, but it's tiny, so we're on it. Okay, for gravity, determining tidal parameters in the deep interior is one of the mission objectives, but we had to shelve it for the fall because in order to keep the spacecraft from crashing into the moon during the extended, there's no such thing as a circular orbit when you're orbiting 22 kilometers above the surface of the moon. So, so we need to do 3 maneuvers a week to keep from crashing, and that required us to make the highest degree and order field that we could. So we're right now navigating the spacecraft with a degree and order 540 field, which is considerably better than what I've showed you here. And so what the kind of correction that you need to get the tides out isn't so relevant then. So we're it's mainly doing very, very precise radiation pressure modeling. So so we'll be working on that again soon. So.
Well, Maria. Let me just, let's thank Maria again for a fabulous talk. And we have here a beautiful certificate. As someone at NASA once said to me, it's the least we can do. It's also the most we can do. So thank you very much for being the Shoemaker Lecturer.
Thank you.